Hello and welcome to this video 2 for weeks 6 to 7 of language learning and wellbeing, invisible illnesses from mind to body and back again. This video is going to look at a particular case study, specifically depression, and is going to look at mental health issues in particular. I'm going to challenge some of the assertions around mental health being something which is always invisible, though I think that our superficial point of view could potentially be that physical illnesses tend to be things which are often more visible and mental health issues tend to be things which are less visible. But we're going to problematise that a little bit. There will be obviously therefore references throughout this video to depression and mental health, and there will also be some discussion of suicide. So if you would prefer to skip this video as a result of that, that is absolutely fine. You are of course within your rights to do so. So let's begin then by thinking about representations of mental health, and we have discussed at several points in this module so far that metaphor is a particular area of linguistic research which orients around discourses around health and well-being, and that this is particularly relevant to invisible and specifically mental health issues. I would remind you that we looked at conceptual metaphor back in week 3 in relation to substance use, so I'm not going to go back over that particular model, which is the dominant model that we use in this area of linguistics to talk about metaphor. But I would encourage you to go back to that video and rewatch it if you would like a recap on conceptual metaphor theory as a very common approach to discussing various health issues, and this is something we're going to pick up in the live session as well. So you will remember, of course, that conceptual metaphor suggests that metaphor is not a device that just exists in poetry or is something which is a decorative kind of add-on to language, but something which is central to the way in which we think and speak about a wide variety of concepts, ideas, and things, and that we often represent conceptual metaphors using capitals, as you can see on this slide here, with a source and a target domain. So we always have the target first. The target is the more abstract thing which is being explained or being conceptualized or understood through a source. The source tends to be something which is more concrete, often more visible, and something that is more common in things that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. So the example that I gave you in the last video was life as a journey, and we talked about journey as a source domain as things that we are very familiar with, that we do every day, and life as a more abstract concept, as things that we take things from that source domain, in that case a journey, and we take particular bits of them that we feel are relevant and we map them on to a target as something which tends to be more abstract, perhaps a bit more woolly, more vague, often less tangible, and we use that resource, that source, in order to explain the target. Two things that I would like to highlight to you, and again I will pop these slides alongside this video so that you can click on this link to see an example of this if you would like to look at, again, something which would be absolutely legitimate material for you to analyse if you're interested in that for an assignment piece. But just to kind of highlight to you these two very common trends that we very, very often find in public discussion about mental health and mental illness, where physical illness is often used as a source, as the more concrete thing, and that ideas about physical illness are often mapped on to mental illness as a target, as a way of explaining, conceptualising and understanding mental illness, because of course physical illness tends to be more visible, something that is more obvious to people, more tangible, whereas mental illness is very often invisible. So the clip that is available in this link, which I'm not going to play for you, but I would invite you to perhaps pause the video and go and have a look at, is a really, really good example of this. And/or we tend to see these things, and as we go through I'm going to problematise this idea that mental illness and physical illness are always easily separable. That visible illness is also something which is very commonly used as a source in order to explain invisible illness. So we take features from things that are visible and map them onto invisible illness. So I said to you in the last video, we might think about the way in which people talk about medication and depression, and that very often people talk about antidepressants as things that people find problematic for people to stay on long term. And if we were talking about that in terms of, for example, diabetes and insulin, that would be something where nobody ever queries the fact that somebody who is diabetic is going to need to take insulin for the rest of their lives. No one is going to say, well, you know, I don't think that's very good for you. I think you should think about coming off it. Whereas we could think about depression in exactly the same terms, but and interesting then to reflect why we often get these discourses in popular media about antidepressants being different to insulin and something that there should be a goal to come off. That would be a really good example of something which is a physical illness being taken and used as a way to explain a mental illness, something which is more visible, being mapped onto something which is less visible as a means of which to make sense of, to try and encourage somebody to understand it. So in this case, diabetes and insulin being mapped on to these more woolly concepts, these less tangible concepts like depression and antidepressants. So two interesting things for us to think about there. Also very interesting to think about the relationship between visibility and how seriously different disorders, disabilities and illnesses are treated. This is a really interesting installation that was on top of a building in London for quite a few years. These are all mannequins, they're not real people. It was left up for several weeks and it was a display to try and prompt more research and funding into depression, focusing particularly on the issue of men who lose their lives as a result of suicide at much higher rates than women, for some of the reasons that I touched on at the end of the last video. This is a representation of how many men, I think it was a week, lose their lives as a result of suicide. And interesting to think here about something that is often a result of invisible illness, so suicide being a symptom, a byproduct of somebody having an undiagnosed or an untreated or an unsuccessfully treated mental health issue, being made physically visible through this particular sign to make it visible, to prompt people to think about it and take it seriously. And this raises, I think, some really interesting questions about what does a depressed person look like? If you were to look at somebody, how would you tell whether or not they had depression? Compared to, for instance, if somebody was missing an arm, how would you tell that they were missing an arm? So a really interesting kind of area for us to start with about thinking about the challenges that can exist around mental health. And I mean, I suppose also some of the positives that potentially exist for people who are suffering with mental health issues, that they often do have the ability to conceal, at least in the short term, that mental health issue in a way that people with very visible, very physically manifest, think about facial deformities as an example, as a point of contrast, that if you were applying for a job, that is, or being a wheelchair user, that is a very, very difficult thing to conceal. Whereas if you so choose to, concealing a mental health issue in the context of a job interview is relatively easy, perhaps, to do. At the same time, of course, this raises a number of challenges for us, because if mental health issues are easier to conceal, they can be harder to spot. And in particular, if somebody is resistant to seeking treatment or engaging with medical professionals, that can be something which is problematic, and it often can be a case where people can go undiagnosed or struggle with a mental health difficulty for a long time because the people around them do not recognise that they are having a difficulty, because telling what a depressed person looks like can be really hard. But so here's what the NHS has to say, and I won't read through these for you now, but these, I think, are the psychological symptoms of depression. And when we talk about depression and think about what it is as a particular illness, that these will be the first sort of things that people will go to when they think about trying to characterise what the effects, what the symptoms of depression are. So I'll just give you a moment to have a read through those. At the same time, however, there are many physical and social symptoms of depression, and this is where I think it becomes a bit more nuanced when we think about the distinctions between mental and physical illnesses, because it is most certainly not the case that people who suffer from mental illnesses do not experience physical symptoms. And some of these I think might be particularly surprising to you, and I'm going to go through as we move through the slides and talk about some of the research around this, around some of the reasons why we might have particular metaphors that we use when we talk about depression, or indeed, is there something about the way in which we conceptualise depression which results in these physical symptoms? So things like moving or speaking more slowly than usual is something I think perhaps is quite unknown as a symptom of depression. Things like disturbed sleep or low sex drive or lack of energy. Thinking too about ambiguity that we discussed in the first video. What happens when you have things that are symptoms that could be all sorts of reasons at their source. So things like not doing well at work or avoiding contact with friends. We find that there are a lot of narratives where somebody with depression will become socially isolated because they experience lapses in relationships with people, because people think that they're just being flaky, or they're just being a bit annoying, or they don't want to go out and have fun anymore. And that is an example where because this illness is invisible and people don't realise that somebody has it, or perhaps don't know that this is a particular symptom of it, that ambiguous symptom is treated as though it is not the thing that is being caused by an illness, but is instead being caused by just perhaps somebody being out having fun with other people, or is assumed to be something which is not a result of somebody being ill. And those I think are really, really interesting. Those points of ambiguity are really interesting for us to reflect upon, and there's all sorts of examples of things that you could think about if you were interested in this topic for a assessment piece. So depression is probably unsurprising to you, given what we've talked about in relation to conceptual metaphor and how commonly it is used, and how commonly we draw on conceptual metaphors in relation to explaining all sorts of health issues. It is therefore probably no surprise to you that there is a wealth of research on the use of conceptual metaphor to describe and understand depression, because depression is one of these classically vague, intangible, difficult to kind of grasp, fairly abstract, in particular if it's not something that a person has experienced themselves or has had a close friend or family member experience of it. It's a very woolly concept. So we find that people will draw on all sorts of different sources of these more concrete ideas in order to describe, understand, explain and conceptualise depression. And I've just listed a couple of references for you there of research that has looked specifically at this. In particular, a very, very prevalent metaphor, conceptual metaphor that is used in relation to discuss depression is this binary of that we tend to conceptualise things that are good as being up and things that are bad as being down. And if you think about the word depression, this conceptual metaphor of the idea that being down is bad is actually represented within the word itself, because depress, of course, means to push down on, and that is somehow bad, and depression, therefore, even in the word itself, uses this conceptual metaphor that bad is down. So this feeling of badness, this feeling of low mood, low energy, comes from this notion that bad is something which is down. And Gibbs explains this. Those of you who are doing Reading in the Mind next semester will come across Raymond Gibbs's research in much more detail. But he says that this stems from the experiences that we have from when we're very, very tiny babies, as we grow up, that we get this conceptualization that things that are bad are down and things that are good are up, and that's why it tends to be consistent. He says during the first few months of life, being down is a natural state serving in maturational purposes. But later in life, when we grow up, being down is associated with all aspects of babyhood, such as dependence, helplessness, and inferiority. And he says because tacitly, so maybe we're not aware of it, but unconsciously in our brains that we have these associations of dependence, helplessness, and inferiority associated with physically being lain down, that are those experiences we have when we're a small baby, that we draw these associations later in life. There's also research that suggests that when we're very small, if we cry, people will tend to pick us up and then will put us down again. So we associate that process of being moved upward as being something which is positive, and as a result that we therefore retain this idea that being bad is down relative to being picked up where it is warm and maybe we get fed, we get attention, we get affection. So really, really, really interesting cognitive psychology research that sort of accounts for why we tend to have these particular conceptualizations. But here are just a few examples of some of the source domains that are often drawn upon to explain depression, and you will see that there are some themes that manifest across them. And if you refer back to those symptoms that were listed in the NHS sense of what the symptoms of depression are, perhaps some of these make sense. So depression is often described in terms of descent, of darkness, of weight, of being a captor, of being down, dark, heavy, or contained. And if you think about some of those symptoms that we have just discussed, we can see again that there are experiential, embodied experiences that people have when they have depression, which would cause them to draw on these things. So depression can cause you to do things like not want to leave your house. That is a form of containment. It might cause you to not want to leave your bed, in which scenario you are both contained and in a downward position, and perhaps you've got your curtains closed so it is dark. It might be that people think about physically speaking more slowly or moving more slowly. So thinking about that as a weight or a heaviness is often an account as to why people will describe it in those particular terms. So things which we don't consciously think about often are the things that underpin and result in the particular conceptualizations that we then draw on. What's very interesting too is that when we then look at representations, particularly in terms of images of depression, and again we're going to look at a more extended example of this in the live session this week, we see that people will naturally tend towards representing depression using these particular source domains, and let me give you a few examples of that now. So I've got the links for where all of these are from. This is a fantastic cartoonist called Gemma Carell. And this is her visual representation of depression. You can see this is a person lying down, so we have the bad is down being represented there, that it's a descent, that it's something where we might think about the nope as being perhaps pushing down, perhaps some sort of captor, something which is creating a barrier to getting back up again. This one too, the warrior pose, really interesting thing where we've got all of these ideas, but look at how these ideas are represented. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment, of course, that Gemma Carell is familiar with conceptual metaphor theory and that she's done this deliberately. That is often not the case with conceptual metaphor theory. What's really useful about it as a model is that it means that we can look in terms of how someone's represented something as offering insight into the way in which they think about that particular thing. And you can see a visual representation of containment going on here. These thoughts are all around this woman who is in a warrior pose, as it's the interesting pun that's been drawn on there, that is blocking her from moving anywhere. So we could think about depression as a captor or as some form of containment being represented here. And two, this is from a different example from a kids' helpline around depression that we can see, again, not a coincidence, I don't think, that this young person is sitting down, whereas by contrast the dog is standing on its hind legs. Good is up, bad is down. We can see depression as a darkness, as a descent, potentially as a form of captor. Perhaps we could even think about this as something which is physically preventing this young person from getting up. That the depression is being represented through this shadow, through this darkness. So all sorts of really interesting things that we could do with visual images as well as written texts. And again, it's just a good example, I think, of the scope of things that you could do if you were interested in this as a particular area. Now, I've talked to you about depression today, but I think this approach would be very, very applicable to any sort of mental health issue, and please do discuss with me or Pete Jones as your tutors if you're interested in pursuing this area. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that you have found these videos interesting. Make sure that you complete the 2 tasks that are associated with this week, and I shall look forward very much to discussing these issues with you in the live session next week.